Hi, I'm Sharon Landon and welcome to Old Asian Lady. Today my guest is Jerome Keating. He is a retired educator, consultant, and writer who first came to Taiwan as a technology transfer manager for the Taipei and Kaohsiung mass rapid transit projects. In other words, the MRT or subway here in Taiwan. He has been living here now for 36 years and has written several books about Taiwan. We chat about his life as an American expat and what motivated him to stay and eventually becoming a dual citizen of Taiwan. He shares his life experiences and shifts in perceptions and thoughts about aging as he now contemplates life back in the United States. So, Jerome, thank you so much for coming to my show to talk to me today.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I was just thinking back because how we met. You remember how we met?
I don't. I thought it must have been at a play or something like that.
Yeah, because you were writing for Taipei Times.
Okay.
And we met you at the stage play.
Okay.
I'm not sure if you went to the first one that I was in, which was
I've seen several.
Perfect Ganesh. Yeah, Perfect Ganesh was the first English language play that I did when I was here. And that was like, when I first came here, that was like 2015. But I do remember you coming to the plays a lot, and then you'd always write an article about the play. So, are you still writing articles?
I have slowed down a bit as far as writing articles, partly because of other involvements in my life, and I focused a little more to writing books and different things. So it's kind of as the spirit moves me. And
I think that's a good way to go through life. So you mentioned about writing books. Now you've written 7 or 8 books now?
Nine.
Oh, 9 books now. Oh, okay. Right. And what's the most recent one that you wrote?
The most recent one is the one, The Paradigms That Guide Our Lives and Drive Our Souls.
Right. We're going to talk about that later. Why don't we just start with, how did you get here to Taiwan, and why did you come?
Okay. Now, it's going to be a little bit of a winding story.
Keep it short. No.
Okay. I came, a short notice is, I was offered a job to be technology transfer manager on the Taipei MRT.
Okay, so before any building of MRT started in Taiwan, you were one of the people that came in to help.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
I was, the first line opened in 96.
Oh, 96. Yeah, I wasn't here, so 96. Okay. When did you come?
I came in 88.
In 1988. Oh.
But there had been people here, the Brits had been here in the early 80s. So there was almost a complicated tale of that. You have suspicions of how the U.S. got the contract from the Brits, and yet we kept many of the Brits and everything. We feel it was like a balance of payments due to the U.S. some way.
Uh-oh, that sounds a little bit... Okay, so the Brits were here. Originally, they had a contract, but then you, being an American, was asked to come here to work on it. So if you came in 1988 and you said that the MRT started in 1996, wow, and the Brits were here in the early 80s?
In the early 80s, right. They had been in the planning stages.
Oh, wow. So this is a really long process to get the MRT going here.
Yes, right.
Mm-hmm. And how was it when you first moved here to Taiwan? What was it like?
Oh, God. I look back I always remember... So you figure it's the late 80s, not that many people have cars, okay? There were no bus lanes, so the buses and cars but when I came, I met a guy in Seoul, Korea when I was coming here, and he had just come out of Taipei. So I said to him, hey, I'm going to Taipei, give me an impression. And he said, motor scooters.
Oh, it's still a lot of motor scooters now.
There are still a lot now, but at that time, there weren't that many people that were rich enough to buy cars because the economy was still developing and all that. They were doing things in China, and people were just starting to get cars. So the place was flooded with motor scooters.
Right.
And he was right at the time. So that's one of the things. And another thing that then it was Taipei was one of those things in a project where you have a bright idea, but it isn't practical.
Oh.
Let me try and translate that. Taipei, as you know, has many lines. The red, the orange, the green, the blue, and all that. Plus the brown line, which is a French Matra line, which is the only light rail. And both the city and the Ministry of Transportation were competing for who would control the ultimate project. The Ministry of Transportation won over the city of Taipei. But at that time, there is all this competition in that. So someone had the bright idea, and I don't know who would throw the blame on. I'll just throw it against the wall. But it said, the normal way you start an MRT is you do just the first two lines and a cross, and then you build on extensions.
Right.
So that basically all the digging is first in that cross section, and then it adds on. And someone said, why don't we, since we're going to have all these lines, why don't we start the whole project at once?
Oh.
Dig all over the place.
Oh, really?
Great.
Not an engineer thought of that.
Great an idea, but in practicality, the whole city was dug up.
Oh my gosh.
And therefore, when it rained, so picture it's raining, there are no bus lanes, and traffic and everything, you're trying to get a taxi or anything. It was a type of chaos.
Chaos.
But, in the long run, was it good to go through those 2 or 3 years of chaos? I don't know. I'm not going to make a judgment on that.
So, aside from that then, was that your first overseas job here in Taipei?
Yes,
oh, okay.
First overseas. I had always wanted to work overseas, but never, had the opportunity, and then this one came along.
And so, aside from that chaos, then, what were your other impressions of Taiwan, or were you like too busy? It was just too much to think about it because you had work to do.
We were pretty busy in those days. We worked 5.5 days a week. So that was the days when you worked a half a day on Saturday.
Saturday, yeah.
So there was the trying to put my head on the idea that, we had always been, in the U.S., you just had the impressions of the newspapers that, Chiang Kai-shek was our friend, the ROC and all that, and there was ROC, PRC competition, and just getting into realizing there was a lot more in the political side. One little thing, I remember one time, we would have these air raid things. We still have them, where they just do an air raid siren and everyone practices the drill. And I remember one time looking at the specifications for our stations, and I was reading one of the specifications of the underground part of the station, and it said, it must be able to withstand a 500-pound bomb. And I'm thinking, that's a strange specification for a station.
How heavy are bombs anyway? Normal bombs?
What?
How heavy are normal bombs? Are they 500
I don't know.
pounds? Oh,
You know, but it's like
I don't know anything about bombs.
yeah, right.
Oh,
How big a
interesting.
bomb is that?
Oh,
I
okay.
don't know. I have to throw it to a military person, I guess.
Oh, so when you guys are building the MRTs, then you had to
And there was
allow
one of
for
the-
that kind of stuff, but it was
Yeah,
just
there was a
something out of ordinary.
specification for
Right.
you know, for stations.
Yeah,
underground
normal
parts.
people. Yeah, normal
Right,
places
but
wouldn't have to worry
when you
about that,
told
right?
me we're in a war zone.
Yeah,
or a
okay.
potential war zone.
Oh, yeah, so that was another thing that you had to deal with then, or it
Right,
came to
right.
light, right?
And today the specifications would be much different.
Oh, really?
You know, because we're talking about specifications in the 80s. But that was always, you know, and I guess it, you know, what it threw to my mind was that I remember in World War II, the British when the Germans were, you know, throwing their air power into the UK, most of the people, when the planes would be coming, would go to the underground. And that's where they would sit out the bombing raids. And then you'd go back up.
Yeah.
So it just kind of made me think they're very conscious of that.
Right.
It was just I was just going through specifications. No.
Lasting impression. Oh, I didn't know what you didn't know what you were getting into when you came to work in Taiwan. Yeah.
Right, didn't know fully at all.
So you've been in Taiwan now for, let's see, if you came in 1988, that means like 30-something years now
Right,
already.
young. I usually go by 90 to now would be 34, 36. And I came at the end in October 88, so 35, 36 years.
Yeah, because you were just mentioning too that 1988 and then the MRT line started in 1996.
Right.
So you were already here 8 years, almost 8 years before working.
Right.
Before the Taipei MRT got going.
And actually, in that time, my contract didn't extend from 88 to 96.
Oh, okay.
I just came on a 2-year contract. And actually, you know, it was just a 2-year contract, do your thing, and come back home, and we'll give you a bonus. But then another contract opened up in Kaohsiung.
Oh, Kaohsiung.
So I went to work on the Kaohsiung MRT, doing the same thing.
Okay, I didn't know that they were. I for some reason I was thinking that Taipei MRT was all done by the time they did something in Kaohsiung.
No. Oh. This is, you know, that's why you have all this pre-planning, and you know that. And you know, as I say, when you really look back to it, but you know, I think the planning was good because the thing runs very smoothly.
It's
and it's something I can look back on and say, I'm very happy I was part of that.
Okay, so then the MRT was built by an American company?
Well, no. When you have to almost look at the organization in charge and how big this thing is, that we had the top 20% of and then all the rest was farmed out through different companies and countries and everything.
I see. Oh, all right. Okay.
And in one sense, as I say, original planning and development had been done by the British.
Yeah.
And then it was transferred to the Americans. But you know, there were many companies, many countries working here.
Okay. So when you were in Kaohsiung, how long was that contract? Or
that was just 1 year.
Oh, that was 1 year. So then that's a total of 3 years. So you're still here. So what happened?
Okay. Well, while I was in Kaohsiung, I got married to a Taiwanese. I had been divorced when I came.
Okay.
So, and met my future wife. I actually met her the first week I was here.
Oh, in Taipei?
In Taipei, yes.
Oh, okay.
And that's another complicated Yen Fen story.
Okay. So then the reason that you ended up staying was because you met your wife here.
Right. And we got married, and she was working with a trading company, and I then, when my contract ended, I did a little bit of work in the Philippines designing a school, and then I came back and got a job as a professor.
Oh, did you? Because I always wondered about that because I know there's a lot of foreign professors that come into Taiwan that teach. But did you have to have as a professor or teaching in a university, was there certifications or something that you had to have, or you just had
Yeah,
your
they
graduate?
vet you pretty well.
Okay.
You have to, send back and prove your degree, prove your dissertation, and all different things like that.
Okay, so you had you already had a master's or doctorate at that time.
Doctorate.
You already had that when you came to Taiwan.
Right.
Oh, interesting. So then what you taught was engineering type of thing?
This is another complicated part of my life.
Okay. We love complicated. No.
So, I could say I'm very adaptable, but my doctorate was interdisciplinary. So it was in literature, philosophy, religion, art, all more liberal arts stuff. But when I was in the U.S., I'll kind of skip to how I switched from being a professor in the U.S. to working in the private sector.
Oh,
but I realized that there was more money to be made in training and development in the private sector in the U.S.
Oh,
and
I see.
I switched into training and development, which fits in human resources. And at the time, I then started working on an MBA to kind of balance that. But that was interrupted. I was halfway through that when I was offered the job to Taiwan, and I never finished the MBA.
Oh, okay. Oh, so you were already a professor at the time when you came here.
Right.
Oh, no wonder then. That's good because I'm thinking, how did you go from a corporate job to a professorship?
Right. Actually, in the U.S., I went from professor to corporate.
Yeah.
And then came here as corporate, and then went back to professor.
So in looking back at that, I mean, what do you prefer, working as a professor or, working in the corporate world?
That's a tough call in a way, because there's something exciting about working on a big project like this and see it come to fruition. There's a satisfaction there. But on the other hand, there's also a certain satisfaction when you're a professor and, the interaction and seeing students learn and helping them learn and, and even then seeing some of your students go on and get a doctorate. There's a kind of, so I've never completely answered that one. I'm happy with them both.
Right. For Taiwan or Asian countries, I guess, maybe more so than the U.S. I don't know, maybe not. But professors and teachers are really respected and really revered in certain ways. So whatever the professor or teacher says, pretty much is how it goes. Even like you were saying, after they graduate and things like that, they come back and they still keep in touch with professors. So in your way, are you still in touch with a lot of the students that you've taught throughout the years?
I'm in touch, maybe not with all that many, but I'm still in touch with, like, one of my students who worked on his both undergraduate and master's with me is now took a job in China.
Okay.
But before he left, he came and we had coffee and chatted about, the dangers of working in China or whatever.
Right. Or what he needs to watch out for or something, since you're such a expert in political stuff.
So I would say, I keep in touch with, with a certain amount of them, but then they, of course, then they get their families and, they move on and all that also. So.
Yeah. What did you teach?
I taught literature, American and British literature, primarily 19th and 20th century. And then also you also teach a lot of the what you might call the grunt courses of conversation, writing, and things like that.
Right. Okay. Did you find that in Taiwan, the students and the way you taught or the way they learn is different than the States?
Yeah, no, because in the U.S. generally the students are more prone to challenge the professor, and ask different things or question different things, whereas here sometimes they're just always writing down everything you say.
Yeah.
But that has changed also. I think now the students are also again shifting in their own paradigm of what a learning mode should be.
And what do you think is the major cause of that?
I don't know if it would be kind of awareness that it doesn't have to be that way. Awareness of, like many of the students here go for graduate school in the
In the
U.S.
States, yeah.
and realize that it is fostered that way, and therefore they come back with those ideas. I wouldn't necessarily want to say for sure, but I think also the idea that, we'll get a little to paradigms here, but Marshall McLuhan had coined the word the global village after World War II. And that with the global village concept, there's a lot more interaction and awareness of what's going on in different countries.
Yes.
And the way things are done, the learning styles. And, many students here are going for their master's and doctorate, and therefore they're learning those styles coming back here.
Yeah.
And, they themselves have gone through the system here, so they know the balance, they know how to work around it or to challenge it or change it.
Yeah, because I often feel that it's so important for people to be exposed to other cultures, because otherwise they're too narrow-minded. I mean, a lot of Americans, America is one example of a more modern type of country, but then oftentimes the citizens, really, Americans, are quite narrow-minded in the way they think.
Right. Yeah.
It's like, oh, yeah.
I mean, politically, I will find, and I won't get into politics too much here, but you will find among the expat community, they favor a more broad, democratic approach to government and everything, and look back at the way some of the things are done in the U.S. and realize that there is a certain narrowness in the way the U.S. branches to the world, or tries to see its own role in the world, and there's a natural conflict or challenge there.
Yeah, well, you're talking more about the government rather than citizens, because I feel sometimes that America or the U.S. is kind of stuck in between a rock and a hard place, because if they don't do something as a world power, then they get in trouble. If they do things as a world power, then they, there's people that are not happy about that too. Yeah, so it's a balancing thing, definitely, that they have to work on. So, you just mentioned like expats and stuff. I mean, do you consider yourself still as an expat, or are you actually local now?
I have two passports. Taiwan gave me a passport under the broad definition of contributions to the country.
Right. And I know you've made many, so.
And then there are certain Taiwanese groups that I am called a son of Taiwan.
Okay.
In other Taiwanese groups, I might not be seen that way, depending on how you define Taiwan.
Right.
So that's one side. From my side, I'm both, still U.S., but I'm also Taiwan, and I can see the flaws in the U.S., and I can see the challenges that Taiwan faces. I have actually considered I'm more I use the word sojourner, that I'm And in a way, in my own lifestyle, I'm not exactly a belonger. I do participate. I contribute when I can. I'm involved in many things, but I'm never. And this is where I get a little into the paradigm stuff. That I always have a certain sojourner distance to things. And
So you accept stuff from both sides, but you're still in a
I kind of work my own path.
Yeah. I know what you mean. I mean, when you're back in the States, for example, do you feel, like it's home though whenever you go back? Because sometimes for myself, because I'm also, in between, at times I feel I'm at home, but lately in the last couple of years, for some reason, I don't have that feeling of, I'm home, because I live in Hawaii, so I always used to think, but now I'm not. I'm kind of like a sojourner maybe too, even though, feeling kind of wise.
Right.
What do you feel like when you go back to the States?
And especially since, my children and grandchildren right now are in Texas, and Texas is a very interesting state.
Yeah, a lot of stuff going on over in that state. Yes.
And then even, and there's Texas, and Texas has 3 of the largest cities in the U.S. are in Texas. Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. And Texas has so many different cultures and sides to it that it's kind of hard to really say, well, what is a real Texan? I'm even like, I grew.
You don't go put on that cowboy hat when you go home right away.
When I was in Texas, I was in Texas from 72 to 88. And that's another story how I got to Texas. That after 3 years of doing my doctorate in cold Syracuse, I went to the Sun Belt.
Oh, so you actually went back to Taiwan, back to the States a certain period of time. You weren't here the whole time.
No.
88.
I just said, what I'm saying is that my original home is Chicago.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And I did, my school in different universities, but the last university that I did the doctorate was at Syracuse.
Okay, yeah, that was in the 70s.
That's damn cold weather up there.
Well, you're talking to a Hawaii girl, and I do not like too much cold. Although I did used to live on the East Coast in Maryland, so get winter there, of course. But I'm still not used to.
I lived in Baltimore
Syracuse
for a little while, and it's not the same.
It's not that.
But there's ironies that you find in life. That one of the ironies of my life is that the reason I chose Syracuse, because it was one of the few that did the interdisciplinary at that time, and I had just learned how to ski in northern Michigan. And I thought, God, I could go to class during the week and ski on the weekends. This would be good times. Well, I bought skis and boots and everything. Got so busy in the doctorate that I skied 3 times and have never skied again in my life.
Oh, really? Well, I haven't skied for years either. When I used to live in Maryland, I did some skiing.
But at the time, I said to my first wife, why don't we go down to the Sun Belt? Everyone in the North goes to Florida for 2 weeks in the winter, and then fights the winter through along all the thing. And why don't if we go to the Sun Belt, then we want 2 weeks in the snow, we can go to Colorado. And then, for in the winter, instead of like everyone in the North going to Florida for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And so that's how we got to Texas. But anyway,
oh, no wonder.
my stories always have a winding part. But I was in Dallas, and between Dallas and Fort Worth, they're very close to each other. But the concept of Dallas always looks looks down a little on Fort Worth and calls it Cowtown.
Oh,
You know?
Cowtown.
And Fort Worth looks down on Dallas and says, Dallas is where the East peters out. Fort Worth is where the West begins.
Oh.
So there's that, if you can sense that.
Yeah, rivalry.
Texas is a big state. It's got oil, got woodlands in the east. It's got the Gulf Coast. It's got so many different things that it's hard to define a Texan in a way.
Yeah, yeah.
And except that they think big and are very proud of their state.
Right. I mean, it's all like stereotyping, you know, when people are not really super knowledgeable or educated about certain, whatever it is, whether it's a country, a situation, for people, they can do stereotyping. So people think, oh, Texas is longhorns, cowboy, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, too, is, you know, when people think of countries, they don't necessarily see all the different nuances and all the different cultures that are within that country. You know, I mean, even in Taiwan has different cultures here too, different ways of thinking depending on where you're at.
Well, and for me, like even working in Taipei and working in Kaohsiung, you know, the lifestyle, the different things that are there, the way they dress, the you know, a lot of different nuances that.
So do you speak a Mandarin now, or are you?
My Mandarin sucks, to be honest with you.
After 30-something years, did you feel like you didn't need it? Or what's the reason? Because I always wonder about that.
Okay.
Because I've worked abroad so many years, and there's so many expats, Americans or whatever, maybe, you know, that go live in a country, work there for 5-10 years, but they never felt like they need to learn the language. And other people just think differently. You know, you want to be more integrated. So what's the reasoning you thought that you didn't need to?
Okay. Well, it wasn't, well, not necessarily that I didn't need to. Part of the reason, obviously, would be that I got married. And my wife was a very talented, competent woman. She could speak 4 languages. So she spoke Chinese, Hoklo, German, and English.
Okay.
And so there were, you know, like almost like certain things I could just leave for her to take care of.
Right.
I took lessons, but later on as my hearing started to go, I found I really had trouble with tones. And, you know, so that was a part of the issue. The jobs that I had, and the MRT, like one of the requirements in both Taipei and Kaohsiung is that everyone had to be able to speak English.
Right.
From Department of Dort's, Department of Rapid Transit, or Kaohsiung. So again, the
opportunity is
they were more forced to learn English because they were learning from us, you know, on the MRT and that. So that was one factor. In the university, I was teaching American and British literature.
Yeah, that's true. So, that's true. Okay, you have an excuse. No.
but do you? It's an excuse. You could, but you know, certain people say you should have done that.
But do you understand Mandarin pretty well?
Some and some not. You know, and now that my hearing is going, I'm probably getting worse at it. But somehow, like the Beatles song, I get by with a little help from my friends.
Yeah. Get by with a little help from my friends. Yeah. Had you ever thought that you were going to be living in Taiwan as long as that you have?
Totally not. And I always tell this story. When I came here, it was a 2-year contract. Okay. Right. Very good pay, no question about the money. But I was leaving my network of friends in Dallas. I was leaving, my children were in high school at the time, so I felt they were okay with their mother. We were divorced, but you know, they were, and it was a good divorce, and a friendly divorce. So I felt they would be okay, you know, where they were and that. And was wondering, well, can I last 2 years? And the company said, well, we'll give you a bonus of 5,000 US if you finish the contract.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in 1988, 5,000 US was a good chunk of money.
Yeah, yeah.
And I said, oh, okay, I can hang on for 2 years. I'll use this as a down payment, get a new car when I come back. I had my overseas experience. I will be happy with that. And then, move on, et cetera, with life. And, well, who knows what, then the Kaohsiungen opened up, and then I got married, and, one way leads on to way. So
Yeah, it's funny how life works, right? I mean, you go through life, and things happen, and then you either accept them or you don't accept them. So for you all the different changes in your life, you accepted it, and that's why you're still here in Taiwan.
Yeah. And you kind of roll with the punches sometimes and adapt. And I guess, if you have that sojourner attitude that we've had, that you're never completely tied to one place anyway.
Yeah.
And
the expression where my home is where I hang my hat.
okay.
Is that something that applies? Yeah, sort of.
Yeah.
I mean, no matter where you're at. Where you. Yeah.
And I could go with that. So it means I can be at home, and I had lived in many places in the U.S., mainly more on the Midwest to the East Coast. But I had actually made it a point in my life to visit every state in the U.S.
Yeah.
Now, I've never been to Alaska.
Me too. I have about 40-something states that I've gone through, so just short a few.
Okay, so we'll go to Alaska. We'll book something.
Yeah.
But in another way, I look back and it's, well, it's always best to leave one thing undone or something,
Your bucket list.
Right. You don't have to do everything on your bucket list. Alaska's always hanging there, and
it'll always be there.
I almost had the chance, actually, but it was kind of wrecked by COVID. My son was taking his family for one of these boat cruises through Alaska, and they invited me to come, but it was the time of COVID, and I couldn't join them and different things, so I had to pass on that. But there's something in kind of accepting that you cannot control everything, and that goes with it.
So in the time that you've been here now, up to now, what do you feel like is one of the your deepest impressions of, or lasting impressions of Taiwan, actually, and what you've experienced during the whole time that you've been here?
That's kind of hard to give a good answer to, but I'll try. One thing I always say, the people are friendly, the food is good. So those are two good things about a country. And generally, the people are very helpful and accepting, even for foreigners, Wagwaran, that help you out in different situations if you don't know the language.
Do you feel that you get treated differently as a foreigner here in Taiwan?
Well, I would say yes. And I'll give you one example. And at least this was an experience in Germany, okay? Because the Germans sometimes some can be very haughty, say.
That's their culture, style of communication and the way they behave. Very.
Yeah. So anyway, I was with a girlfriend at the time, and we were on there's a ship that goes from Hamburg down the river across to the UK. And we booked it. You travel overnight across the North Sea, and then you wake up in England, and then take a train to London if you're going there, etc. And so we were on this ship going, and I remember I just came up to this one guy was sitting there with his wife, and he was German, and I asked him some question in English, and he pulled one of those, what I call a dumb German thing, or very haughty. He says, he says to me, "I don't understand you." He says it in English, of course, but kind of playing on the thing.
You got the...
And I felt like saying to him, "You speak English like a French cow."
Oh, no.
He was German. I knew he was German.
Yeah, he wouldn't like that.
But anyway, you wouldn't get that in Taiwan.
Yeah.
You wouldn't get that kind of haughtiness that that it was kind of funny. People are more accepting. If you don't know the language, they will make allowances generally, unless you've been there a while. They say, "Why the fuck don't you learn?"
Well, if you have an Asian face here, they kind of have that attitude or look because they expect me to be speaking better than, or without the accent. Actually, it's I always feel like, especially now, I feel quite at home. I'm used to living here compared to when I've first came back, very first time in 1980. But now that I've moved back, I feel, it's a comfortable
your
place.
Original home? I knew you were from Hawaii, but
Yeah. I was born here in Taiwan, and then I was adopted when I was 5 or 6. And the first time I came back to Taiwan was after 14 years after I was adopted. But at that time, I was so Americanized, and I probably had that German hoity-toity behavior because, it was. Yeah, I had an attitude. Yeah, I'm American, here I am in Taiwan.
God,
and that's a thing. That's a terrible thing when I think back about it. But in terms of what you were talking about earlier about paradigms, it's a shifting of people's perceptions and what they think based on new experiences that they have or new knowledge or new education or whatever that they have. So, of course, now... oftentimes I'm quite embarrassed about when I think back at that time. But now, I try to improve my Mandarin, although I still have an accent. And when I joke about it, it's not necessarily that people are rude to me. They just expect me to speak Mandarin like a normal, because that's once again goes back to the perception and the expectations.
Okay.
You see somebody, you have a perception of them.
Right.
And you expect certain things from them. Right. But when it doesn't happen, it kind of throws you off. So normally
if you and I were together, they'd expect more of you than me.
Exactly. It's just the story of if I was in a group of, the only Asian in a group of foreigners, going to dinner or something like that, and maybe 2 foreigners speak better Chinese than me, or they're fluent in Chinese, but that person, the waiter will always ask me,
right.
And then if
here's the pro.
So it's based on the way people look and the way people think.
Well, now, do you speak both Taiwanese, Hoklo, and...
Oh, no. I barely speak Mandarin. No.
Okay.
No, I speak Mandarin, and I'm getting much better at it, partly because I've been living here for so long now. Before, when I was doing business abroad in China or whatnot, my clients were always speaking in English too. So I didn't have the opportunity. And really, if you're not immersed in the culture and having to speak it all the time, it doesn't progress as fast. But yeah, I still speak, and when I open my mouth, I still have an accent, but I'm working on it. And generally, if people from Taiwan, and they kind of know that you're from somewhere else. But it's just funny because they'll always ask me if I'm from Hong Kong or from Malaysia or, one of those countries that have the foreign English accent.
Okay, right. But, Singapore, there.
But yeah, I think perceptions and what you're talking about in terms of global village with your book about paradigms.
Yeah.
I feel it's so important, especially in the situation that the world is in now.
Yeah. Now, in that book, I advocate a shift from a global village to a global home.
Okay, and
That's, you know,
can you
that-
explain the difference in that?
Well, as I say, the global village concept or paradigm comes about after World War II, and Marshall McLuhan is kind of, I think, the one that is named as coining that. At the end, World War II involved all countries in the war, and it was fought because you had Germany and Japan, linked, so it was fought in Asia, was fought in Europe, and it was a global war. And the Brits, where people from their colonies were fighting on their side, of course, so their colonies, as they used to say, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Well, it does now, but at that time it didn't. But they drew, so all those people were also involved. So he coined the term, at the end and also people then, the industries that developed, they realized they got their materials over here in this country, they manufactured them over here, they had their head offices over here, and they sold them over here. It was all like a village, different parts of a village, and not a, global. It was a global village there.
Yeah.
So, but I'm advocating that we have to go from that global village now to realizing a global home. Now, a global home, that was a big paradigm shift with McLuhan, but most companies have adapted to that. But the global home paradigm means you've got to bring in concepts of the environment. In other words, if Earth is our home,
Right.
the environment involves the whole. You can't drill
world.
for oil
Yeah.
over here and say, who cares, or anything like that. So it involves that. It involves an economic establishment that treats all as family members. In other words, therefore, and even, I come from a big family, so I know there's not total equality between, I'm one of the older brothers, so we dominate a little more. No, not quite.
Yeah, I'm a younger sister, so I'm the other end of the spectrum.
Okay, we'll talk. But there's still a certain respect and care for everyone in the family as a family member, even though there's still some kind of hierarchy or, but there's no special privilege for this one and not for that one, and that has to be developed. And it's a change, it's a paradigm shift that we have to become. So we got economics, we got environment, and we got everything else that comes with prejudice, discrimination, and everything. Even the whole thing, the female thing that still very much. In the U.S., back in the '60s, I was involved in civil rights. I was involved in the Vietnam War protests. I was involved in many issues. Well, those things are global now. That was just, at that time, local U.S. issues, but you got to bring that. This is where my driving force is, and the global home, and then the possibility, which is developing, say our destiny is our galaxy. That's, where it sounds strange, but...
Meaning beyond Earth.
Yeah, right.
Right. So,
eventual colonization or whatever is out there. I've got to believe there's other life out there also. So
yeah, I believe that. That.
And so we may get in a Star Trek or something situation, but we've got to be more prepared for that.
I think that maybe the general people are not necessarily. Not the general people, but people who don't pay attention to global things or international things, because oftentimes I say certain people only have a mindset of, hey, I'm in this country, or I live here, this is my culture, this is my surroundings, and I don't need to go beyond that. So I feel like only people that have been exposed or worked abroad or traveled abroad, which is happening a lot more, you know. I mean, young people nowadays, they go all over the place, you know. Taiwan, I know a lot of kids. Robert, he travels a lot. He lives abroad. A lot of people have these chances to be exposed to that other environment.
Right.
And I feel like that makes them have a more open mind to to what you're talking about in terms of a global home and what it is beyond what we have now as Earth only, or our home at this point. But I totally believe. And how do they? The thing is, I understand, is going to be a challenge really to educate the populations or the masses about this.
Well, this and maybe, is where, remember what I said at the beginning, is that you find, at least I find, among the expat culture here, you know, a greater world perception of world things, even if they're from the U.S. or from the U.K., than the people back home, because they, you know, we see things totally different and a broader combination. And I can give you a couple paradigm shifts in my own life if you've got time for them. I'll give you a couple that two work different ways. The one paradigm shift was my family originated, you know, three of my grandparents are from Ireland, the others from what was then Bohemia and now is around Prague, so Czech Republic. But I had grown up, so all my grandparents were immigrants to the U.S. And I grew up with all the stories of Ireland, you know, so I always wanted to go back to Ireland to see the home of my grandparents and all that. And it always just seemed like a big jump to me that, you know, I was there in Dallas, and how, you know, Ireland just seemed miles away. And one time I entered a contest where the prize was a free trip to Ireland. And I said, wow, this is my chance. I was write the essay and all that. I didn't win, but my paradigm shift came where I was having breakfast with another friend, and I was telling her about this dream. I wanted to go see the family home, etc. And she said, well, you know, it's not that expensive to go to Ireland. You know, we were in Dallas at the time, and she said, I knew you could fly to LA, it'd be just about as expensive, and live there in a hotel or something, then fly to Ireland and then it was like, kind of the scales dropped up my eyes, and she said, yeah, look at the Sunday paper. I looked, and yeah, you know, 10 days B&B, flight and everything. So I got my girlfriend at the time, and we went to Ireland. Great time. Visited the family farm and everything, but that paradigm shift of why did I think it was going to Europe and everything was such a obstacle to overcome than going to LA or so, and there was really the same. So after we did that, you know, because we went to Ireland because the language is basically English there, and then next year we said, hey, let's go to Germany, you know. So that started my travel overseas. So, you know, that was a kind of a paradigm shift.
It was a shift in your thinking.
You know, it wasn't.
And sometimes it just takes just a little thing that happens in somebody's life to make them make that shift, you know, and think of things differently. Okay, so what was your second one?
Okay, the second one is kind of a reverse thing. This was back around 2007 when Chen Shui-bian was president, and I went with 4 academics or advocates from the U.S., and we went to Europe to 7 capitals to advocate for Taiwan, get more acceptance and whatnot. And so we went to 7 capitals in Europe. You know, we went to Brussels, Paris, London, Prague, Warsaw, Budapest, and can't remember the other. Vienna, and And that one, because also when you grow up in the U.S., you know most of your immigrants, the country was built from colonizers from Europe and all that, people coming for freedom, different things, to start a new life, build a city on the hill. And so we always, at least, I would kind of, from education, you always look, well, the Europeans had so many experiences in diplomatic things and wars and power struggles and everything, whereas in the U.S. we had our Civil War, but we were basically pretty isolated.
Yeah.
And so we went there, and I was expecting to find so many people with wisdom, and I didn't.
What do you mean by the wisdom that you're talking about?
In a sense that, and I hope they don't take this as too detracting away, but they didn't know anything about Taiwan.
Oh, yeah.
The world affairs over here. They were so concerned in their own struggles over there. We were advocating for the whole issue of Taiwan, versus China, the democracy and all that. This is again in 2007. So I always say this, and I came away because we met with legislators, we met with media, we met with professors, and not that many people had answers.
Yeah.
And I was expecting much better answers or wisdom, I realized there aren't that many smart people in the world. I don't know if that sounds too derogatory or not, but I think it was more a realization that sometimes you can set people up on a pedestal and they don't belong there.
Yeah. I feel like that happens a lot sometimes.
They didn't know anything that was happening over here. So we're talking about 2007, the last years of Chen Shui-bian, and what will later on come and all that.
Yeah, because I feel like Taiwan, for some reason, talking back about those countries, is their mindset is not an international global thing. They're only, probably worried about stuff in Europe and da-da-da. Taiwan is way far, like what you thought before. Yeah, but so they would not...
They've got to worry about the Russian there.
Yeah, exactly.
All the different things, or all the radical things that...
Yeah, so in one way, I feel like being part of because it's going back, Taiwan it's still the same. A lot of people don't know about Taiwan now. They think that we're Thailand. A lot of people think we're Thailand. But I think the thing about the paradigm shifts that you were talking about is I feel that once we ourselves have a more open mind and shifts in our own perception about things, that we're able to be more open and accept that other people's haven't gotten there yet, or they're just not there.
A different type of example about this would be, say, like Brexit. How many people do you know in the UK that regret Brexit?
Because they didn't understand it. Because oftentimes I feel like, like you were just talking about earlier about going to all those protests, I'm sure, Vietnam War, maybe some things that were happening in, what was that university?
Civil rights.
Civil rights, all kinds of stuff. There's one particular college in California that was really, what's the name of that?
California.
No, there was one specific college that was really known for. Always, but so that's the thing, is that so many people,
Francisco, I think.
So many people attend those rallies and attend those riots or protests or stuff. They don't really know the real situation. They just go with the flow, and they just go with what people think or what they hear. A lot of that is happening in the U.S., and we won't talk about the U.S., but it's the people don't educate themselves, but they will still be part of something that they don't understand, and they can have opinions of things that they really don't know much about, which is, fine, but in one way it's fine. But for this global home thing that you're trying to bring about, or trying to get they probably take a little bit longer time than other people to accept that concept, you know, in terms of being outside of where they are.
Right.
So anyway, I also wanted to talk to you about you know, your concept of aging. I mean, where you are at now, I feel like you're quite you know, you're at where you are. How old are you now? Are men allowed to say that? Because women don't really like to say that.
Aging.
No, but do you feel like a few years ago, maybe like 10 years or 15 years ago, compared to now, have your thoughts about getting older or being older changed?
Let's see, that's a good
paradigm
question,
shift.
how to phrase that, because, you know, about trying to think back, about 15 years ago, you know, I remember I was telling you I climbed Taipei 101 in less than 30 minutes. So I know my body is not holding up as the same way. But I think, with aging, and I wrote on this with Euroview about poets' views on it, but it's kind of like you look back, you know, I look back at my life and I see it through 5 generations, okay? You know, I see the world my grandparents lived in and why they immigrated to the U.S. I see the world of my parents who lived through the Depression and what they had to do and whatnot. I see my own generation, which went through civil rights and Vietnam and everything. And then I see the generation of my children, and now my grandchildren are starting university, which is god-awful expensive in the U.S.
Unless
And this is a paradigm shift. You know, I look at education, you see here, you know, we have national health insurance. And, you know, the U.S. has had so many years ahead of us. National health insurance here came around 1992 or something. I'd have to look up the years. So it's very recent, but it can be done. And so you're wondering, why the heck can't they do that? People are paying through the nose over there.
Because certain people want to make more money.
And here they control big pharma better than they do in the U.S. And this is, I don't want to get too political on you, but that's one thing that, you know, I see how education is much more economical here. My students here, you know, when I was teaching even in a private school, I think they were playing around, you know, $2,000 US a year. You know, my grandkids are starting, even in a state school in Texas, you're paying like 18,000 US or more.
Crazy.
You know, just for tuition. You know, what priorities, what are we balancing? You look at a country like Denmark. I was just reading something, and I don't know how true, but even in Denmark, someone that works at McDonald's or so gets 6 weeks of paid vacation during the year. I've been in Denmark, beautiful country. I like the way it's run. You know, much more, I would call it liberal thinking or open thinking. And so, I look at that, and, you know, people say, you know, the U.S. is, you know, at such a pedestal. Well, no, the U.S. has got a lot to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that because, you know, when you're able to see different perspectives and see them clearly and know what is possible and what isn't possible. You know, it's just, like you said, it's amazing that sometimes people just don't get it. It seems simple, but it's not. Because you know, one of the things that I've gotten since I've come back really is understanding that Taiwan may seem to other people a real backward country. You know, they don't know about it. But actually, there's so many things in Taiwan that are so much more efficiently run and done more efficiently than in you know, in the U.S. or in other Western countries. You know, so.
they have a great MRT system.
Yeah.
I don't know who those masked men were that did that.
Yeah.
No, but you look at the MRT system. I told you, I'm very proud to have been part of that whole thing.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine when Taiwan didn't have the MRT because it's so efficient and so easy to get around. And not only even that, the whole public transportation thing is pretty efficient, And then taxi galore, which are still cheaper than a lot of places in the world. But so is staying in Taiwan then option, or you talked about your family in the States, your grandkids?
Okay, this is what I've got to figure out a way to balance in my life. I want to spend more time, because once my grandkids graduate from college, they're off doing their own thing.
Yeah.
So this is kind of like my last chance to be part of their lives and contribute what my experiences have taught me and share it with them, so forth. So I want to spend more time there. And yet, of course, there's so many advantages to living here that this is what I've got to figure it out. That's my next challenge.
Right. Did you give yourself a deadline, or you're pretty much go with the flow, which
I'm
is
a
always
more
what
go
you
with
said.
the flow type of guy.
Yeah. Well, I know that it's a big decision, especially if you lived here for so long. It's quite different moving back. But then once again, you have the support of family back there. We'll keep in touch always. And I just wanted to ask you if people wanted to find you and read more about your books, where would they be able to find the books? Or where would they find information about you? Okay,
my Taiwan books, Taiwan history and Taiwan mapping and all that are at SMC, Nantian bookstore. That's over by Taida. It's on the street behind that McDonald's on Shinshan South Road. My language books had been done with Crane Publishing. I don't know where they have their office. But I do have one book that most recent, and we talked about my paradigm book. And this is where my thought has developed, the paradigms that guide our lives and drive our souls. That so many people our souls are driven by certain perceptions of the world, and I still can't understand why. Sorry to get a little too political, why Putin went into Ukraine. So many people have died for what? I don't know. But anyway, I will be giving you a copy of this.
Oh, thank you.
And you can check it out.
I still feel, because we talked a lot about paradigm shifts and changes of perception, and you're mentioning about, the global home, and necessarily that in the future we have to think about the galaxy, going into the galaxy and going in the future. I feel like it's pretty important nowadays too.
Well, when you realize that our galaxy is just a small galaxy, and there are millions of galaxies out there, and that paradigm shift to the vastness of what's out there makes you think of your own little world as being somewhat minute and totally yet unattached or unresponsive to or unaware of, everything. So we've got to settle our problems here in a way before we can go out there, but we've got to work at both.
We are been found already. Never know, the possibilities are there, that if we're here in a galaxy and the galaxy is so vast, we said, I think there's life out there. Who knows what's going to happen.
Well, this book is dedicated to my grandchildren, so hopefully by the time they get to be, out there working and that, things will have developed more.
Yeah, amazing. Great.
So I will give that to you.
Thank you so much, Jerome. And thank you really for coming here and sharing your time with us and telling us some of your story and your life experiences and how you shifted in so many different aspects of your life in terms of the paradigm.
Okay.
Okay. So thank you all for joining us again on another episode of Old Asian Lady. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Take care.